Diocletian and the Roman Recovery by Stephen Williams. I had said that it was a really good book, but I hadn't, because of copyright issues and all that, I hadn't reviewed it all the way through the book, and I'm still not finished with the book. I'm still reading it. But a couple of things need to be said right away about the tie between what Paul says in Ephesians 1:10, all those, 5 clauses, and what Williams is writing, not knowing about the meter, in his chapters 12 and 13. And I have to make this addendum because he's covering an angle I didn't know. Because I didn't study the Diocletian thing until, what happened with Paul. I mean, that's the whole reason I got into this, is I saw the meter in Paul, and I'm like, that's Diocletian? I don't know anything about that period. So that's why I've been doing so much studying and stuff. One of the facets of this period, on the pagan side, is that the picture that Williams paints in his chapter 12 titled "The Gods Are Alive," and you might be able to see some parts of it in the Google link that's in the video description. One of the pictures he paints is that there was apparently a great, well, he calls it syncretism. I would call it something more like convergence, which is exactly what Paul's talking about in Ephesians 1:10. A convergence of ideas about God to a oneness of God. The syncretism was so extreme that even the so-called philosopher schools among the pagans started to cast their philosophies more and more in religious terms. Now, that kind of has always been a feature of philosophy. The Greek word is kenotes. It was defined by Plato in the Philebus, and it means harmony with the gods. Okay? And I'm trying to find the page where I saw him talk about that. Yeah, here we go. I can read parts of this. I'm reading from his page 155. Okay? I'm going to just read the paragraph so you can understand what I'm saying. Page 155, it's the middle paragraph. I'm going to start reading. Central to the social religious attitudes was the concept of pietas, which embodied, in a way we have lost since the rise of liberal individualism, the deep obligations which tie a person to their social roots, more basic than any contract. It encompassed the things one owed to one's parents, to one's city and country, to the ancestors who had built and handed on what existed and whose culture one inherited, and to the gods who protected all these. The god, or the genius of a city, represented all that was precious and permanent, that distinguished a homeland from just a collection of buildings, and its way of life from the arrangements of a passing tenant. Another such concept was felicitas, not personal happiness or random good luck, but the healthy, thriving, proper to a person who lives and acts well, indicating that the gods are on his side. It included the notions of success, influence, and fortune, not a chance condition to be envied, but a virtue to be admired. The righteousness and fitness of the ruler was to be inferred from his felicitas, as much as from the wisdom and justice of his acts. The deep connection between pietas and felicitas was not purely a contingent one, a casual exchange whereby a person or city bought the god's favors by sacrifice, both were aspects of the same broad attitude, which was entailed in having the right kind of relationship to the gods. And that last phrase that I stressed, I've stopped reading now. The right kind of relationship to the gods. That's the definition of the Greek term henotes, which is mistranslated unity in Ephesians 4, 3 through 5, 3 through 6, and is misused, of course, by the Catholic Church. It is not unity sideways. It is not unity with an institution, although that's indirectly implied in henotes. It's unity with the gods, right relationship with the gods, harmony with the gods. Okay? Now that's exactly what Paul's talking about as a trend of history at the very time that Williams is writing this backdrop to Diocletian in chapter 12, titled The Gods Are Alive. He's writing that there was this, among all the pagans in the Roman world, there was this sudden urge to start seeing the gods as part of a bigger picture run by one God. And, you can argue how much Christianity had to do with that. Williams is arguing it had to do with the Mithras cult, and specifically Manichaeism. Okay, the guy Mani, who was from Persia, but Mithraism was also from Persia. But this whole idea of even the philosophers suddenly taking on a religious cast, so to stress this business with harmony of the gods, and suddenly the differentiation of the different gods is no longer seen so much as a differentiation of different persons, but rather more like the Hindu concept of aspects of the oneness behind it. And that's why Aurelian, in the period between 238 and 250, which of course is Ephesians 1:10a, plants the cult of Sol Invictus, which, only a few years prior had prompted riots by the soldiers when Heliogabalus did it. So just a few years later, you got Aurelian doing it. Alright? And they started to see Sol Invictus as another facet of Jupiter. Alright? In other words, the distinguishing marks between the so-called gods are blurring, and they're looking above that to a oneness of an ultimate God behind it all. Okay? So when Paul writes the idea of, fullness of times, pleromatos, in Ephesians 1:10a, pregnancy, that's a 14-syllable section, which means it's a pivotal time in history. Whenever you got doubled sevens, that metaphor goes all the way back to the first 14 that Israel was going to miss in Psalm 90. That's the provenance of that meter metaphor. So it really is very pregnant that there's a coalescence, a sort of impregnating of the two different worlds of God ideas. The monotheism that's coming mainly from the East in various flavors, Christianity being part of that, maybe even dominant, and the pagan concepts, because Hinduism is basically, all at once, it's many gods and only one. That's the heart of Hinduism. Alright, so the same kind of syncretization, that's Williams' term, is coming into play in the Mediterranean basin. Now, of course, Septimus Severus had kicked the whole thing off in the 190s because he literally contracted himself to find somebody the gods wanted him to marry. This was before he became emperor. And he ended up marrying a Syrian woman who was from the priestly sun cult tribe in Syria. That's how Heliogabalus brought the sun god to Rome. Okay, so they had kind of been prepped for that idea since the 190s, and you have to argue that Jewish monotheism and Christianity had a whole lot to do with that development, either because they were sympathetic to the idea or because they wanted competition. And I already covered in the Bishop's List video for 11T9 F through I, how, the Catholic Church was itself coalescing at the same time, and how the whole competition problem, with Christianity was also going on. And there was the most important aspect of those videos was the other thing I didn't know about church history, which was that the Severins, these are the wives, the Syrian sun god priestly caste, were listening to Hippolytus and Origen. And of course Severus Alexander, who was on the throne, had little lares made of Jesus and Moses alongside with whatever else other gods he was worshiping. So there was a tendency toward this syncretism, which was alien to past Roman culture. They'd always been tolerant, but they never merged them. So what Williams is saying in this book, in his chapter 12, The Gods Are Alive, is the pagan counterpart, and explains why the Hippolytus and Origen could get so much of an audience, with the Severan imperial family. That there was an acceptance that was actually growing. Okay, so that explains more why Paul writes, the pregnancy of the times, fullness of times dispensation, in the very years when that was actually going on. And then, of course, following up with that at the latter part of Ephesians 1:10, which I've already shown in videos many times, the uniting of everything under one head, all of heaven and all of earth, which is, of course, what Diocletian ends up doing. But the trend of the syncretism and the unity and the going from many gods to one ultimate one behind them, that started before Diocletian, which explains why Diocletian's adoption of Jupiter and Heracles, aka Hercules, was so accepted so readily. Having chief gods, and it was pharaonic style and all that. And of course the pharaonic style is much more pointing to an ultimate number one god, versus the gods, versus the Greek style, which is much more democratic. So this was really pretty exciting. I would really recommend you get his book. Chapter 12 is on the pagan side that was switching towards syncretism. And then chapter 13 is going to be on, the persecution, the Diocletian persecution. And that I'll cover later.